A bride buried alive on her wedding day, a rotten mansion built over her grave, and a new wedding party ready to evoke her spirit. That's the promising setup in Cassandra Khaw's Nothing But Blackened Teeth. This novella has received high praise from horror greats, but its bright spots are hidden under heavy tarnish. This book is a quick read, but is it worth your time? Let's see. This story centers around a group of friends you stopped talking to after high school. Thais and Talia are engaged despite a rocky relationship and want to be married in a haunted house. Their all-American friend Philip is the son of rich parents, so he accommodates by renting out a haunted mansion in Japan. We later learn that Philip and Talia were lovers at some point too, and our narrator Kat is here to support them even though she's had some tricky history of her own, previous relationships with both the young men. She also experienced a case of what she called terminal ennui, which involved thoughts of self-harm. At the start of the story, Kat is admiring the mansion with her friend Philip, and then she reminds him that he ghosted her when they split up. And she resents the fact that he feels guilty about it too, and they've talked about this many times before. Here's how she puts it. It wasn't charitable, but apologies didn't exonerate the sinner, only compelled graciousness from its recipient. The words, each time they came, so repetitive that I could tune a clock to their angst, sawed through me. You can't move forward when someone keeps dragging you back. Kat, you brought it up. Character behavior is one of my biggest issues with this story, especially when it's presented with overworked prose. Now, broad vocabulary is great, and ghosting and breakups do hurt, but 20-somethings butting heads over past relationship issues did not feel like a compelling conflict worth building this story around. This is not The Big Chill, and their vapid dialogue really clashes with the elevated prose. Anyway, Kat grew up in Malaysia, and she was exposed to ghost stories at an early age. Among her group of ghost hunting enthusiasts, she may be specially attuned to supernatural phenomena, and so she hears a voice that nobody else seems to notice, quoting lines from an old Japanese poem. The poem refers to waves reaching a mountain so high it should never be touched by the sea, an impossibility that could only happen if a lover abandoned the one she loved. So who's reciting this line of devotion? Well, according to legend, the mansion was going to be a wedding venue once before, but the groom died and never arrived, so the bride demanded to be buried alive under the house. As Philip explains, she said she had promised to wait for him and she would. She'd keep the house standing until his ghost finally came home, and every year after that, they buried a new girl in the walls. Why? Because it gets lonely down in the dirt. So the dead want company, and soon newlyweds are gonna have their first dance on a ghost bride's grave. That's an interesting setup. We get a tragic history for a potentially vengeful ghost, and we have tension, even if it's a little juvenile, among the wedding party. Gasoline that just needs a supernatural spark. And to make things even more volatile, let's throw in another caustic character. And this one's comic relief. In chapter 2, we hear the squeal of tires to announce the late arrival of Lin, a married man who still acts like a jet-set bachelor. He cracks jokes, none of them are very funny, and while he invited the boys to be groomsmen in his own wedding, we later learn that he views them all as interchangeable and ultimately expendable. And he's also dated Kat, but it got weird and he did not invite her to his wedding, and she resents that about him too. So he brings a feast, and the frenemies all eat and drink until they've had too much, and then they decide to play a game. The name of the game is on your screen. I was excited to see its inclusion in the story. I've heard it called 100 Candles or 100 Ghosts before. It's a storytelling game where everyone shares their scary stories in a room lit only by candles or lanterns. At the end of each story, they snuff out another light, and the room gets darker as the stories get scarier. And it might just be a ritual for summoning spirits. But before the game can really get started, Lin picks on Philip for renting out such an extravagant home, and he accuses Philip of still having feelings for Talia. We've been told many times, many ways that Philip is big and strong, and he's ready to attack Lin for the accusation. So there's tension between these two as well. None of these people seem to get along with each other, and it makes you wonder why they call each other friends in the first place. But before they can settle down to play the game, Kat sees our ghost bride in the mirror, and as annoyed as I had been reading the story up until this point, I really did enjoy the panic that we see Kat go through when she sees the ghost. Gripes about Khaw's purple prose have merit, but they can write a good horror moment when they want to. After that brief ghost encounter, the group settles down to play the game, but by the time it's Kat's turn, she starts slurring her words. And look, if Kat has a history of crisis, no reliable friends in sight, and a potential threat there in the house with them, she should not be getting Waffle House drunk and telling stories. Anyway, all the candles go out and the supernatural events become harder for anybody to ignore. But even as the horror creeps in, this story suffers from some recurring distractions, and that includes the writing itself. There are many moments where simple actions are just overwritten. As Kat describes a mock wedding scene, footsteps charted the mathematics of their motions, a drag of fabric as Talia swept around the bell curve of her orbit, Phase's plodding shuffle falling a quarter beat behind, Philip's footsteps crisp and hesitant, loud on the wood. Lynn was the only one who moved like he wasn't weighed down by sins, nearly noiseless as he padded along behind me. And that's not so bad, but I didn't want to go back through this whole book just to point out the worst offenders. We don't all have to sound the same, but the prose here gets so abstract at times that it gets in its own way. When we're focused on an intense feeling, it's appropriate to elaborate on what that character is going through, and vivid description can really set the scene of a haunted house, and I think that's done well. But we don't need that much attention for every gesture or facial tic. At one point, someone throws their hands up in surrender, and Kat tells us that if his fingers were birds, they would have broken. Well, I'm glad the fingers weren't birds, Kat. This author could have killed a few darlings. The writing, elegant or otherwise, should serve the characters, the scene, something. But the narrator would often pull away from the scene to over-elaborate on some detail that did not warrant the distraction. In contemporary fiction, elevated language can come across as pretentious, but it can work. I don't think that it did here, though. Ornate language demands a graceful execution, and many times throughout the book, the writing reaches too far to be natural or even clear. Frustrations aside, the book's horror elements come across well when they're given the chance. Our central ghost figure is rooted in Japanese folklore and history, a bride with blackened teeth. The black-dyed teeth are said to be a symbol of beauty and maturity. The custom was usually reserved for married women, with some exceptions, and originated during the Heian period, the same era that the story's mansion was built. There's some speculation as to why women were expected to blacken their teeth, maybe for hygiene or just aesthetics, but the process required exposing their teeth to iron filings, usually with other ingredients like sake, vinegar, or gallnuts. And the ghost herself is an established form of yokai, or spirit. She's a trickster known as the Ohaguro Bettari. The ghost bride's face is almost entirely featureless, all but a mouth full of teeth dyed black. Some yokai are more malicious than others, but this one seems to just enjoy scaring people. At night, she appears as a beautiful woman dressed like a bride, and she singles out a young man and calls him over, keeping her face turned. But when he approaches and she turns around, her face is porcelain white and blank, all but a mouth full of blackened teeth. She doesn't really cause any harm other than the sudden fright. That's how a lot of these folktales go. In fact, there's a whole category of faceless spirits in Japanese folklore. They're called Noppera-bō, and they might be a human-shaped disguise for a trickster spirit like the kitsune. But I think there's some interesting implication in the very lack of a face. That's where your personality is, your expression and your identity. Something you might have to give up for the societal expectations of marriage or a forced live burial. And in this story, the bride doesn't really pose any physical threat to our characters, but I don't think that's a bad thing. She sets the action in motion by appearing and replacing one of the characters, causing them to disappear, but all the violence that follows is completely on the hands of the wedding party. She just observes the bloodshed and laughs. That feels in keeping with the Ohaguro Bettari lore. She plays her tricks and laughs at the confusion that follows. Maybe the greatest weakness in this book, more than the prose, is the cast. They feel like stock slasher movie characters, even though this is not a slasher story. And they make numerous references to what would happen in a horror movie, as if subverting those expectations would still be a surprise at this point. And they're juvenile, hurtful, selfish, mean, pot-stirring jerks. Kat tried to split up Phase and Talia because they were not getting along. Talia really resents Kat for the attempt and wishes that she were not at the wedding. When we get a glimpse of Philip's background, it's almost entirely referential to his school days. Homecoming king, valedictorian, chess wizard, debate captain, and good at sports. We're told early on that his varsity jacket still fits perfectly on his quarterback frame. He's the sort of character that would survive in most horror movies, except for the ones where they don't. and Lin excels at provoking others and escalating tension to a boiling point. And he does this while dishing out poorly timed jokes too. We get comic relief where suspense should be allowed to build, and in the middle of one character's desperate plea to be sacrificed to save someone else, we are treated to this Lin rambling. He's crazy, plum-stirring mad, although I suppose anyone who was forced to stir plums for hours would go mad. Is that how the line goes? Plum-stirring mad? Plum mad? I don't know. It's such a weird whatchamacallit, don't you? Shut up, Lin. This story is only 124 pages. We don't have time for this nonsense. Maybe the varsity jacket was a warning that everybody in this house is stuck in the past. Their priorities and personalities have not grown with them into adulthood. There's a bit of writing advice I've seen here and there, that if you take away the horror elements from a story, you should still have a good story. Now, I don't know if that always works, but if you took the horror elements out of this story, you'd be left with nothing more than a bunch of miserable characters and the worst bachelorette party ever. A while ago, I saw a thumbnail asking if Nothing But Blackened Teeth was the worst book ever. No way. And I'm willing to bet it's not Cassandra Khaw's best work. They've been nominated for some major awards and won a few. I wouldn't write them off just based on this novella, even if I'm not in a hurry to read more of their work. If you're looking for a ghost story drawn from Japanese folklore, you'll find that in Nothing But Blackened Teeth. If you want to invest in characters and grow closer to them through the course of the story, I don't think that will be part of your reading experience. There are some good bones here, but not a whole skeleton. The house itself, its haunted past, and the ghost were all interesting and for the most part illustrated very well. But insufferable characters and purple prose hold everything back. In the acknowledgements, it looks like Khaw struggled with this story, and I think any artist can struggle to find their own diamond in the rough. But not every writer has Ellen Dotlow telling them to keep going. Now, I won't claim to see what Dotlow saw in this story, or what inspired any of the glowing reviews on the back cover, but that's the amazing thing about fiction. It reaches everybody in different ways. So with that said, if you're looking for some contemporary Gothic horror, read Mexican Gothic. Honestly, I'm afraid I can't recommend this book. I won't tell you to buy it, but if you're curious, check it out from your library. If you love fiction, don't forget to take advantage of this very valuable resource in your own community. And if you love horror, stick around because I have more coming up soon. That includes another book review, which I think will be much more positive than this one. But that's all I have for today, so bye for now.